once again, thank you, and thank you to our panelists. I'll start with a quick introduction, uh, even though arguably an introduction is not needed. Renuka Ramnath, who is the founder, managing director, and CEO of Multiples Alternate Asset Management, a firm which manages more than 1.5 billion in assets. Hello, Renuka. She has 30 years of experience in the Indian financial services sector across private equity, investment banking, and structured finance, and has built several successful businesses for the ICICI Group, and then in partnership with several extraordinary entrepreneurs over the past decade. She's also the chairperson of the Indian Private Equity and Venture Capital Association, something that happened earlier this year. Congratulations on that, Renuka, and commiserations on that too. Thank you for joining, Renuka. Pleasure to have you. Sudhir Warrier, who is Managing Director and Deputy CEO of Multiples. He has 2 decades of experience in financial services with a strong track record of leading investments across a range of sectors, including financial services, healthcare, logistics, and infrastructure. Sudhir also works very closely with us at Sanctum, which is an investee company of Multiples. And it's always delightful to talk to him about the business, the environment in which we're operating, and getting all his ideas and experience to bear in the way we think about our business. So Sudhir, an absolute pleasure to have you with us too.
Thank you.
With that, let's get into the discussion a little bit, ladies and gentlemen. Renuka, perhaps I can ask you to kick things off with a sort of some overarching thoughts on where we are, vis-a-vis the pandemic, the government's response, the state of the economy, and the outlook going forward. Are you seeing some interesting themes emerge now that we are 7 months, from the time that the lockdown really started? Arguably, the pandemic is slightly longer than that. Could you just give us an overview to get us started, and then we can get into some more specific elements of what's going on in the markets and business? Renuka, may I request you to unmute your...
Sorry, yeah. So there's no sound from my side, right, Shiv? It's okay?
Absolutely fine,
okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. First, Shiv, thank you very much personally and to Sanctum for having me on this webinar. It's an absolute pleasure to talk to your customers. They are special for 2 reasons. One, most of you are investors in Multiples third fund. So it's a great privilege and honor for me to talk to you, and also personally thank each of you for the confidence you have placed in us. And 2, they are your customers. Sanctum is one of our portfolio companies. For me, each of my company is like a child of mine. So it's very, very special. So thank you for being Sanctum's customers. So let me give a shot to, Shiv's questions. I was telling Shiv earlier in the week when we were talking about this webinar that I want to keep it a little less formal and more fun, because, there are enough things that are bothering everybody's head. I don't want to make this a very serious affair, although investing is a serious affair. So that is not to be mistaken for we not taking our business seriously. So to coming to, kind of Shiv's questions, I would say that when the pandemic first hit us, if I were to just go back and relive my own life from mid-March until now, it has been a wave. So honestly, I would say that, mid-March, I thought that we were giving a very exaggerated response to this pandemic. Could it be this serious? Could it be this harmful? Are we panicking too much? Was the first, for about a week, I thought that, are we trying to excessively copy the West and so on and so forth? And then it dawned on me that this is going to be really serious. And then I swung to the other end of the pendulum, and so did all the companies and the economy, that you had to really plan for complete doomsday. You don't know when you will come back. You expect that the cash flow projections of all your companies will be an extension from the past, and you are unable to project out when incomes will come back. For different companies, it affected in different ways. So as you can imagine, in case of our exposures to financial services companies, we started to worry once RBI announced the moratorium that what if 80% of our customers take the moratorium, then we would have no cash coming back. We would still have our obligations, and how do you plan for it? We had a few companies in our portfolio which were physical businesses like PVR, Arvind Fashion. You don't know when these shops were completely shut. So for the very first time in my life, I had to deal with a zero revenue situation. One has dealt with a lot of volatilities. I have seen many economic volatilities, capital market volatilities, global crisis volatilities, both Asian crisis and global financial crisis. So you knew how markets would behave under these economic adversities, which is something, again, one couldn't have planned for. But planning for pandemic is something I have never thought I would have to do. So we swung to the other end of the pendulum and started making doomsday projections, and extremely worried about our portfolio as to what would happen and how these companies would survive to see another day. And another thing, again, I've learned from my experience is that to be successful in my business or any business, it is important to be around. That is about the most important requirement. You have to be around to see a successful day. So if I don't keep my companies around, even when businesses come back, whether they come back after 12 months or 24 months, if they are not around, they are not going to be there to celebrate the success. So survival was the only game that we were playing for, but we did have a very exacerbated projections in terms of how much cash flows these companies will need or burn before they survive the pandemic and come out. Then there was a phase of this expectation from the government. Government will recognize this as something which no corporate could have planned for. They are really the backbone of the economy. Finally, government has to bail out businesses. And, there are so many countries in the West who are giving so many doles out. And maybe Madam Sitaraman will pick a few lessons and leaves out of it and implement. So there was this phase of hope. So first was a phase of denial, then was a phase of complete panic that the worst has hit us. Then there was this hope that the government would do something. And I was doing meetings after meetings with various authorities in the government, and also as IBCA chair, since I was representing the entire industry where we had extremely young companies to highly mature companies, and multiple asset classes, not just private equity, real estate, infrastructure, so many things. We really thought that we would impress upon the government to say that this is an industry that gets you 30, $40 billion of capital every year, and therefore you should do something. All of that fell in deaf ears, and all of us will distinctly remember Madam's address talking about how she would give, basic food necessities and provide food for really the bottom of the pyramid, and the rest of the more capable people should go out and take care of yourselves, and that is all that we can do. Then the question was, okay, now this is Atmanirbhar era, and you have to find your own good solutions. So let's go to banks and make a plea as to why they should support you with more liquidity. And that was not coming. That was for me the biggest disappointment. The best of the companies which were AA rated, AA plus rated, did not get capital, especially in companies which had a severe onslaught of COVID related problems, like our retail companies, did not again find any support from the banking system. From there, we moved on, and salute to all the entrepreneurs of corporate India. Where I stand today, I am extremely optimistic of our portfolio companies, which are arguably the best of the companies in their respective spaces, which is why we have chosen them as our portfolio, as a candidate for investment from our funds. They have really tightened their belt. On an average, I would say that some of the best companies have cut 20 to 25% of their fixed costs permanently. And even when the business comes back to normal, these costs aren't coming back. They have embraced technology and looked at every line item of operating expense as well, and to see how much can I bring down this cost, how much can I eliminate human intervention and bring down my overall operating expenses. So there is a tremendous amount of very high quality work that has happened across the board for me, across all of my portfolio companies. And I like to talk about what I see personally. I'm not a person who feels comfortable to talk from what I read in the books or what I listen in the news or some analysis that is put out by really bright people, either in my shop or in Sanctum shop. I feel more authentic and more comfortable to speak from what I'm personally experiencing, about which my blood, my bones can speak. And I am super impressed with what my portfolio companies have done. One, with respect to the agility with which they changed the annual operating plan. So I have a very young company in my portfolio called Quantify. It's a very young company. They are in the artificial intelligence, machine learning space, largely catering to customers in the US. And the moment the pandemic hit, middle of March, by middle of April, we had a new operating plan, because in an IT service company, planning your hire and phasing them out and keeping your costs commensurate with your revenues is the only name of the game. And they did it so beautifully, such that their profitability margin percentages have not shrunk even marginally. And the business is already coming back, and the annual operating plan for 2021, my advice to them is, please try and keep it to the old plan and not a revised new plan based on a reduction that you saw in 2020. So I'm just sharing one example, but this is something that we experienced in 100% of our portfolio company. The agility with which the management moved to change the plan and manage each item of cost and negotiate with the entire ecosystem of their supply chain, right? People who are standing behind you and the customers who are standing in front of you. How do you manage the entire supply chain not to disrepute yourself in trying to financially manage the affairs of the company? So, where we stand today, therefore, I feel tremendously optimistic. One, because I have now personally seen how agile our good managements have been, how they took to cost reduction, how they further re-engineered their business to have some permanent gains going forward, which is going to help them eternally. And in the emerging landscape of business, which I truly believe is only for those highly successful companies and managements, they are going to be operating in an environment where their weaker competition has become even more weaker. And it is just a matter of time that they will either get consolidated or they will vacate the playground. So you're going to be standing in a market which will have the same size and glory as it was pre-COVID. Arguably, in the shorter term, it'll be a brighter market because all the pent-up demand will come back to life. And the companies which are strong are going to have a less competitive, less confusing marketplace with a much better financials and higher profitability to go out and address that opportunity. And the banking system will also have already started loosening their belts and looking at some of the strong companies for financing. So I expect the market, the financing mechanism, and the intrinsic capability to all come together to make these companies even more valuable in the 2022-2023 timeframe. But this is not the real story. The real story for me is what demonstration I saw of my management team. In multiples, we believe that we invest in people first. The reason why we make any investment, 97% of the reason is the people and 3% is the business. It would look very bad if I said 100% is only the people. Therefore, I'm just putting a notional percentage. In this entire journey, what has really touched me is whether my management teams had 10% ownership in their business, 25% ownership in their business, or 0% ownership in their business. Everyone has acted like an entrepreneur. People have volunteered and put up their hands to take salary cuts. People have volunteered, put their lives at risk to win business, to kill themselves in this work from home, instead of working for 12 hours, working for 15 hours and 16 hours, and keeping their companies afloat. So it is this deep emotional connect, a sense of ownership, and this extraction of the entrepreneurial spirit, which was somewhat dusted, somewhat covered in a normal growth scenario, which has now got exposed and invoked, which is going to make these companies tremendously more successful than what they have been in good times. So as we speak today, the current year is a bit of a write-off. We are still very, very ambivalent and unsure about when and how we will come out of the pandemic. We feel almost sure that up until March, nothing very dramatic is going to happen. There is a hope that, post March, slowly, the virulence of the pandemic would also die down. We will also learn more to live with it, and things will start to come back to normal. Even if it doesn't happen in March, let's say only by September next year, we get back to normal. Nothing is really lost because our companies are really now well prepared to live within the means that they have. The moment we come back, and that we have to, these companies are going to go out and grab everything very profitably from there. So I think that this has been a tremendous learning experience. I do worry about the growth rates in the economy, but I would say that having seen so many crises and felt like we will never come out of it, I am also a very, very big believer in the resilience of our economy. And the moment we are liberated from this pandemic and some of these physical constraints are taken away, I think that we will charge back and come back to the old levels of at least 7.5% growth, maybe from middle of next year onwards. And for the good companies, that would translate to at least 2 times that growth rate, and for the very good companies, 3 times that growth rate, which would be sufficient for us to make the kind of returns that we would expect from our investments. So this has been the journey. I just wanted to lay it out as it occurred rather than be academic, and I hope I was useful.
Very useful indeed. Renuka, thank you very much. I think the biggest part of this experience for many people are the human stories behind everything that's gone on, and the stories of dedication, resilience, creativity that's come out. And one of the hopes is that that kind of behavior sustains once things go back to something resembling normal, because that is a game changer in many people's minds. I suppose I was going to ask this question later, but I suspect now is the time, Renuka. We've been, based on what you were just saying, we've got, we've seen a recent draft of high frequency macroeconomic data, which is looking positive. You had a decent earnings turnout from companies, listed companies as well. In fact, I was looking at a business confidence survey recently, not business confidence, economic confidence sentiment, and it was from business managers, leaders, and it was looking quite positive. So is this finally a V-type shape coming through, or is it a bit premature to say that and vulnerabilities still remain? Because the survey itself talks about a 12-month kind of average timeline across industries to get to a position which they consider normal in some form or the other. What is your view?
Yeah, no, I would not plan for any V-shaped and go and, hire people, or, if I were running any of these industries. I would say that, see, because we are a young country and we are underpenetrated on any metric we take, whether it is financial products, consumer durable products, or whatever. So, and increasingly the confidence level of people to spend and not really save for future, given again the average age is so low, is also high. So it would come back, but too soon to say that it will be V-shaped, and I really don't expect a V-shape. It will be always volatile. And I would build my companies to take care of volatility rather than assume a very sharp one-way street spike and go and start building capacities to take care of it. I would not recommend them to do that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Renuka. Perhaps I can pose a question to Sudhir. Sudhir, on underlying businesses, there's divergence between Wall Street, Main Street, Dalal Street, Main Street.
Yeah.
And it's been extensively covered on account of monetary policy being one of the drivers, market structure, investor sentiment, and so on and so forth. But it's also true that a large part of the economy is not actually in the listed capital markets.
Yeah.
Not just the informal, but even unlisted businesses in a lot of what we deal with here.
Yeah.
So what has been their experience like as we see some of these very optimistic earnings reports coming from the listed companies? How are you looking at that?
Yeah, so I will also take what Renuka said of saying examples of what we have seen in portfolio companies, because that will give a good estimate. So we have in our companies, for example, say pharma companies, which have not been at all affected. For example, we have this company called Encube Ethicals, which is in the derma-focused space. Where the company this year was the year where the company was starting US export sales. So initially when the pandemic hit, one thought that this entire plan of starting their own ANDA products, etc., will get impacted. But today, 6 months into the year, they are thinking of revising their budget upwards because they have done better. They have gained better market shares than what they had estimated their products would gain. So this year, the entire profit track record, the EBITDA projections, etc., are higher than what we had estimated in the month of March. So there are these kind of businesses as well. When we kind of become very, we have to remember that it's a diaspora of businesses that we have. Similarly, on the Natco Pharma side. Again, one of the companies that was seriously affected during the initial days of the pandemic was a hospital that we own 100% of called Vikram Hospital, where the first 2 months, because everyone was delaying elective surgeries, we had, after a fairly long period of time, a month or two of EBITDA, negative EBITDA. That has again, and thereafter, the hospital is in Bangalore, and we had to give 50% of the capacity to BMC for treating their allotted COVID patients and so on. But despite that, in the last month and a half, things have come back so much that we are now saying that probably we will end the year achieving about 80% of what we had budgeted in a pre-COVID time frame. You look at a company like Arvind Fashions. Of course, it's a listed company and therefore it will be coming up with results and so on. But broadly, the trajectory that one sees is that if the first quarter was about 0% because all shops were shut, the second quarter would be about 40 to 45% of the same time previous year. Third quarter, which is obviously aided by the Diwali momentum and the consumer spending that has picked up, etc. It presumably internally what we feel is that probably they will achieve about 80% of what they did last year. So the trajectory is fairly clear. And as Renuka said, it doesn't look. Now, in terms of whether there will be the joker in the pack is whether things will go worse, etc. But we have now also the company itself builds greater resilience during the period, right? It now knows what it is to handle the worst. And therefore, whenever something hits again, you are in a much better, better prepared. Of course, we also have companies like Dream11, which has been like a rocket ship. It is shooting all all targets that is set for itself. One, there was a joke going on WhatsApp. I don't know if you have seen it, that that this is where IPL started and this is how COVID has removed. All we needed to do was start cricket. And there are some of these. So by and large, what is becoming clear, everyone has, as Renuka mentioned, costs have been rebased, technology has been reimplemented, the use of technology has increased. Another example that one would give is a company called Vastu Housing Finance, which literally caters to the self-employed segments of the society. Their average ticket size is 11 lakhs. 75% of their lending is to self-employed, so 25% is salaried. One would assume that they had a very serious impact because of COVID, right? 42% of their customer base in the month of June had availed of moratorium. The balance 58% was still paying EMIs. In the month of September, they have 96% of their customer base has paid the installment that was due in September, because that was the first month of the moratorium having got over. So the resilience is very high. There is a fundamental resilience in the economy. There is at many of these segments itself, you think positively. So generally, when you see at all of these, you become far more optimistic than what it looked like about 3 months back, where one thought that it is this year is a write-off and stuff like that. It looks like, yeah, maybe one quarter we had to write off and things are now coming back. We still have certain companies which are not, for example, PVR, theaters have just started opening up in certain parts of the country, still very early days because content has not got released, but these are companies with very clear market leadership. And one knows that when things come back, they will come back into they will regain their position. So by and large, from our portfolio, there is reason to be optimistic and feel that even if there is some amount of, unless things really go bad, if things there is a second wave, but it is we are able to control it and stuff, things should probably look unidirectional. The fact that mortality rates are so low and all the statistics that is around it, the confidence in the system. Today, when you speak to doctors, etc., they are far more confident. And we have, for example, in Vikram Hospital, we have been handling COVID patients since the month of March. And initially, what should be the treatment given? And now the protocols are in set. When a patient comes in, you exactly know what the way to handle. So by and large, it looks like things are now under control and we are far more optimistic of the future.
Good. So I think to a degree, this optimism that we're seeing in listed companies is also being reflected through the lens of your unlisted company in your portfolio, of course, adjusting for specific sectors which have been affected because of the nature of their operations. I understand. So Renuka, one of the themes at the beginning of the pandemic had been this flight to quality, the idea that strong businesses will get stronger and that there'll be a lot of consolidation and strategic partnerships. And it's only a short time, but how has that played out?
So of course, the stellar example in front of everybody is Reliance Jio, which was getting money as though money was going out of fashion and you somehow had to park it with Mr. Mukesh Ambani. That is, while I said it in a lighter vein, it is a fact, right? I mean, people wanted to park money to play the India internet story with a player who had size, scale, and the wherewithal to bring it to life. And I'm seeing this across the board, in terms of the flight to safety. One is, whether it is attracting capital or attracting human resources. Quite obviously, the strong companies would have significant advantage, and both these form the foundation of whether you can build a valuable company at all or not. But the third thing that I'm seeing, Shiv, as something that is playing out consistently is ability to attract good partnerships. See, from an era where we were all building companies because we thought that the only way to do business was to compete, not to collaborate or partner. This emergence of digital businesses, which are trying to woo customers from offline businesses, and the promiscuity of the customers moving from online to offline in a seamless way is something that most major businesses have accepted, and now they are saying that let us figure out a way of coexisting. So in this, strife of finding the right online offline partnerships, again, I'm seeing that it is the strong offline companies which are getting strong online partners. And together, they are going to increase the gap with their other offline businesses. So that is further exacerbating the gap of between the very strong companies and the not so strong companies. So all these three factors together, finding good talent, finding high quality capital at the lowest cost, and finding great partnerships in an era which is undergoing this massive transformation arising from digitization of the economy, is going to create some very, very valuable companies. And we are in multiples very focused on getting a meaningful sliver out of that play.
Thank you, Renuka. We'll come and examine that a little bit more in a minute.
Just to give an example, Shiv, I mean, sure. Sudhir did touch upon it. So now that it is, it's kind of in the public domain, I can share, although it's a private company statistic. So when we invested in Dream11, we had a lot of intelligent conversations in our boardroom about how big can this company get. In the previous year, the company had 2 million registered users, give and take a million, it really doesn't matter. And then we said that by 2023, if this company gets to about 30 to 40 million users, we will hit a comfortable 4x on this investment, and that should indeed be possible. And in 2020, we have crossed 100 million users. Now, how often do you get positively surprised and of this magnitude? And that's the beauty of the digital economy. So how do you pick the right opportunities there and bring to bear the entire potential of this whole digitization opportunity is a very, very exciting space to invest in.
Thank you, Renuka. I think I just want to extend that, touching upon a couple of things you mentioned. One is, of course, Reliance, and the big Reliance Invest Fest, as we call it. But also the idea that these types of businesses are creating these huge opportunities at some scale, and that obviously represents the India structural opportunity also. But the offshoot of that is that we've had 36 billion plus in the first 5 months of this year in FDI. I think that's the largest ever. Of course, a lot of it is that InvestFest and other related similar types of transactions. And maybe there's more to come. And so what do you think this means? Because that also means that there is, so India may be looking more interesting as a destination from the structural opportunity point of view, apart from the new platforms that are getting created on scale. Or is this a one-time thing which is specific and not necessarily a sign of things to come?
No, this is definitely a sign of things to come. So hitherto, Shiv, the only foreign inflow, or substantive, the only is the wrong word. I mean, substantive foreign inflow was in portfolio investments, FIIs, right? Who invested in stock markets. They picked the best companies. They picked the companies which had good research coverage, high liquidity, a large percentage as a floating stock, and good governance. These were the three requirements to pick a company. And typically they would play the economy. So when an investor comes into India, he'll buy an SBI or an HDFC or something to play the entire Indian economy, or he would buy an ACC or a Gujarat Ambuja or whatever, right? So that was the starting point of foreign inflows, because people were very worried about, I can come into India with my money, how do I take the money out? So you needed to be in highly liquid stocks to take the money out. Systematically, there has been progressive involvement of alternative assets in this country, and the alternative asset investments have been driving change. So we went ahead. Bharti Airtel was the biggest story for Warburg Pincus for a long time, that you went and invested and built India's first, large telecom company around this whole GSM space, which was an emerging space. Over time, we have seen that, large portion of private capital came in really for building companies. So you had minority investments coming in, let's say Piramal Group, Marico Group, HDFC, all of them. These are strong companies, good managements, which attracted capital. From there, we went on to see this whole digital revolution, building renewable power companies. So new thesis where there is no listed stock available, but there is a massive macro opportunity. So you saw a lot of capital coming into either export-led businesses in the pharma sector. We had Lupin and others raise a lot of capital. You had money coming into infrastructure, which was all being done for the first time, and then renewable energy, and now the digital economy. The next wave is going to be one of corporate restructuring. So it is my bet that by 2050, 80% of corporate India would be institutionally owned. Even as we speak, I think more than 50%, Sudhir can correct me, if I leave out the publicly owned public sector companies, which are government owned, more than 50% would be family owned. But this has to change, and I'm already seeing that. The current wave is one of restructuring, spinning out certain businesses which are amenable for partnerships, spinning out businesses which are not core to my core business. I incubated them, or I got into lateral kind of diversification. I'm spinning out and monetizing value. The next phase is going to be actually families getting out. Even as we speak, very, very large families, family-owned businesses of multi-billion dollars, where the family is owning 50, 60%. When those owners get to 70, 75 years of age and have children who have no interest in this business, they're going to say, let me convert this into cash and give it to my children to do, the businesses that they want to do, because what will happen after me? So this is not a one-off thing. This is a wave. The institutionalization of ownership of corporate India is a wave which cannot be stopped. So this will go on.
Thank you, Renuka. I'm conscious that we want to come to questions from the audience, but I have 3 or 4 questions, which have also, in fact, come from the audience in a way. I want to get through those and turn my attention a little bit to the fund more specifically.
Yeah.
So again, Renuka's talked about the nature of transactions and how they might get phased over the next couple of years. Can you just talk a little bit about the sectors? I mean, you speak of liking financial services, pharma, IT. You also talk about the theme underlying that, and that's something for Fund 3. And of course, within that, if you could also just talk about financial services more specifically, because I mean, since the IL&FS crisis, at least the lending businesses have gone through their own entire reconfiguration of, let's say, the lending ecosystem, as it were. So kind of, if you could just briefly summarize, how you're thinking about the sectors that are most exciting, what's exciting you most, the types of transactions within that, what's happening with financial services.
Correct. So, Shiv, we believe that in the last 5 years or so, and over a period of time, a lot of things have happened which are very positive for the financial services sector. While we have had the rotten eggs kind of being exposed in the IL&FS, etc. But what has also happened is, for example, let us say infrastructure financing, which is where the largest part of our NPAs have been, which has been to lending to power projects and so on and so forth. That has got reasonably well resolved. Today, if you talk about infrastructure financing, which has been done in the last 5-7 years, you find that these have gone to renewable projects where the period of construction is much lower. You find that it has gone to these hybrid annuity projects, which have got well settled. You find it has gone to transmission projects and so on. So today, the last 7-8 years in that particular sector has been well-funded projects which have got completed. Road contractors are getting their performance-linked bonuses and so on and so forth. So balance sheets, the lending opportunity is looking very good, even on that, or even on something as something we used to discard as infrastructure financing. On the from the retail financing side, the opportunity has always been good, and now we find, for example, our own experience of setting up companies like Vastu has been that if your ability to really use technology and address a discovery of good quality credit and servicing them has been very positive. We like areas like insurance, for example, which for a long time we were unable to look at, but now there are opportunities which are opening up. So as we go into the next 3-4 years, we still believe that there will be a great opportunity to invest into lending. At this point in time, we are being cautious in the sense that we just want to see to what extent is a balance sheet affected before we take a plunge in. So the last 6 months, we have been going slow on credit-linked investment opportunities, but we now feel that as things are getting settled down, we should again start seeing that. On the tech-led side, we have spoken about some of the companies in our portfolio like Dream11. We have investment in Delivery or Quantify, which Renuka spoke about. We continue to believe that these are going to throw up significant opportunities for us. Pharma and healthcare have always been an area of choice. Again, we spoke about Ncube, which is in a very niche pharma space. On the manufacturing side, while we have not done manufacturing for a fairly long period of time, we do see green shoots there in the sense that this entire production-linked incentive mechanism that the government has started, which essentially almost shifts this entire strategy from a make in India to a make for India and giving incentives for that purpose, which is again seeing interest that is created. So we are again re-looking at some of the things that we had not been looking at for a longer period of time. So there are, we think that the next 3 years, because of all of these, should be a fairly interesting period. A lot of, in fact, even before the crisis, it was not that we were in a rocking economy. And we have spent, I think, the last 5-6 years, a lot of work has gone into, I won't say clean, partly cleaning up the system, putting some of these institutions in place, changing the way auctions were held, changing the way the NCLT process and so on. All of which I think puts us in a much better stead right now to say that we can look forward to a more optimistic 4-5 years. But for COVID, I think it would have been faster.
Okay, thank you, Sudhir. I think the underlying theme in many of these sectors, but particularly financial services across the whole range, is that there are a number of structural enhancements that are being made that should provide a much more solid platform for the future in the form of regulation, debt resolution.
And you have faced the brunt of it.
We have borne the brunt of, and yet we remain excited about the sector.
Correct. So I think all that needs to be done has now been done. So now you know what is there. So you can now just stop thinking about regulations and thinking about growth.
That's right. See, there is this book called Radical Uncertainty written by John Kay and Mervyn King, the former governor of the Central Bank of England. And he says in that the basic premises is when you're dealing with markets and life, there are puzzles and there are mysteries. Puzzles can be solved, mysteries can't really be solved. So I think what we've been dealing with is a big mystery and now it's been converted to a puzzle. So maybe we'll be in a better position to deal with it going forward. On that happy note, I've got a couple of questions and I think they sort of relate to this. point that we're making. Sudhir. One is on financial services specifically. You or Renuka could take it, and then one relates to interest rates. So this question is, when would the Indian financial advisory include global market investments, and why is it not happening now? So, Sudhir, would you like to take this, and then I'll.
No, so sorry. So Shiv, could you just elaborate what's meant?
So I think the question is Indian financial advisory. That means we go out and advise our clients largely on domestic.
Correct.
And so you know, when will it expand? I suppose to a degree it's been happening already in different forms.
Yeah.
But I think that's the question.
Yeah. So we have been, as Shiv, you know that Renuka and me, both of us have spent all our lives in ICICI looking at the domestic market. And we continue to be so much more excited by this market that we have not thought about it. But frankly, I guess it is a question more for you, Shiv, than for us.
I think I will take this.
Because as you,
I think, I don't know, Sudhir, whether it is linked to capital account convertibility. Right now, only the LRS money, right? And that is also quite restricted.
That's right, Renuka. So I think I would say that, you know, it's thus far been restricted because of convertibility issues, the restrictions on the amount that you can send out, the restrictions on what you can do with it when you send it out, which don't allow you to do beyond a certain amount. And so what has happened as a result, and of course, part of it has also been commercial demand supply. You know, a lot of people who've been sending money out have been focused more on buying houses or, you know, funding kids' education and so on. So I think both commercial elements, demand supply, and regulatory constraints have prevented this from growing. Hence, a big ecosystem around this has not been built up, the infrastructure. And infrastructure means in India, outside as well. But I would say optimistically that there are signs that this is starting to happen. People are giving out licenses for international advisory in a limited fashion. The GIFT City plan is to allow precisely this for firms. And you know, once the infrastructure starts taking hold, then you know, people will be able to do more. We have more today in the form of domestic feeder opportunities into international investment. So the idea is, so I mean, my simple answer is, there are a number of steps that are now being taken, and it is starting to gather the momentum where I think over the next 3-4 years, it could become quite big. Historically, it is these constraints that have prevented it from growing to the size that the opportunity could become. Also, there has been a preference on the part of domestic investors to be quite domestically focused by and large, but that has been changing also. So that would be the answer to this question. Sir, if you have a follow-on question, please feel free to ask it. Otherwise, I'll move on to the next one. So these, or Renuka, you know, there is this question on interest rates which have come down anyway since the financial crisis. There's been a secular downward movement in global interest rates. Monetary policies remain loose and got looser still. In India, the same thing has happened. And in India, they also want to reduce real rates in a structural fashion. Which means headline rates are going down, real rates are going down on a 3-4 year basis. Now, as investors, which is the context in which we engage with our clients, people are used to thinking about much higher rates. Yeah. And these lower rates, of course, are good for the economy. We get that, you know, obviously cost of capital will reduce, make it much easier for firms to get financing at levels that don't seem as usurious as they are right now. But how should investors think about their returns in an environment like this? So I'm adding my question to the question I've been asked. How should investors think about returns in a situation like this going forward? And then also, you know, how would you think about it in the context of Fund 3?
Yeah. Renu, you want to take it? Should I?
No, you please answer if I have anything.
Sure. So, yeah. So Shiv, my sense is we are already in a negative real rate scenario, right? Where investors are, we are not covering for inflation. And in a capital hungry society, which we should be, given our state of growth of economy, we should be a society where capital is required. And this is not sustainable for long. The reason why it has come to this pass is because investment activity has not yet picked pace, and it has been very low for a period of time. I think this cycle has to turn. The credit cycle has to turn. There has to be a pickup in investment activity. like all economics activity, low investment scenario can't continue for too long. And my sense is probably we are reaching that phase where things will turn, investment activity will pick up, credit demand will pick up, and that will all start pushing up the rates. Also the fact that at some point the central bank is also going to start thinking about inflation targeting, and therefore they can't go ahead with this scenario for too long. So my sense is probably we are close to the bottom of the interest rate cycle, that we are in probably unsustainable territory already, where so from looking forward, one should think about both interest rates and therefore all of the antecedent rates thereafter looking up.
Okay, so I guess you're getting a flood of follow-on questions. So some directly related, some tangentially related. But
I would only say that you know, we are and we will continue to be in a regime where investors, for beating inflation, will have to choose between risky debt and equity. And I would say that a risky debt is more risky than equity because it has a capped return and the same amount of risk. Because as we know,
I think so that
system and our security packages, you know, you can't rely on enforcing your security packages and covering up for your debt using the legal system. So taking a meaningful amount of exposure to equity will be inevitable for any saver, you know, to take care of the inflation in the, you know, in the long term is what I would say. Yeah.
I think in any case, from we talk about the 10-12% excess return that you would expect on longer term investments by virtue of the ability to find the type of opportunities which otherwise you wouldn't have access to. And if that 12% becomes 10%, then so be it. It's still in excess of the opportunity cost that you're going to be looking at as an investor. There is a question here which says, given the current slowdown, while equity investors can make expected returns over a longer term, or I suppose that's a statement, could you share how this is impacting the venture debt space? Is there a sign of stress already being witnessed in the, and you were just speaking about that, Renuka, perhaps you could take this.
It's a very, very evolving ecosystem, the venture debt, right? The only replacement product for venture debt is equity, right? I mean, somebody will have to put in fresh equity in those companies for them to pay down the debt. And since the equity markets have had their own share of volatility further exacerbated by the COVID scenario, and also in underlying fact of a portfolio of venture capital invested companies is that some of them may not find that capital. So the riskiness is very, very high. So I would say that we are dependent on a handful of investors to bail you out, who necessarily practice the spray and pray strategy, because that is what venture capital is about. And you are investing in debt instruments in the underlying companies. So I don't know, Sudhir, if you have a different opinion. According to me, it's a hit and miss space.
Yeah, it has to be, it is highly, you have to be highly selective. So venture debt, it is unlikely that it can be a very big asset class. You can have some small opportunistic funds, but is it scalable, and can you become like a venture capital ecosystem or a private equity ecosystem? Can you have an asset class called venture debt which will grow? I think there are very lot of other segments of the credit market which could indeed grow. For example, the entire mezzanine debt space or the structured debt space, which has almost disappeared, or probably the high yield space, which was being done by mutual funds, which were probably not the right player to do it. Probably it will now get done by more closed-ended funds, like whether AIFs is the right vehicle one needs to check, because AIF still has to have a very high level of interest in tax incidence on it. It's not tax efficient for investors. But those are still interesting markets and which could be real large sustainable market. But venture debt will remain a very small asset class. There will be a couple of nice funds because the opportunities that you can really say is they are venture but still can absorb certain amount of debt will be very few.
And as Renuka said, I suppose there is an element of adverse selection that is there in the structuring itself in the first place. Okay, I think that covers that question. But there is a question here which says, and I'm going to go on with these and then we'll come back to Fund 3. But this is about opportunities in the listed space, since the fund also looks at the listed space, and given the sharp rebound, do you still see good opportunities at attractive valuations and any specific sectors? That's the question. I guess, I mean, you've already talked about the sectors that are interesting in the context of Fund 3, but in the context of listed fund opportunities, perhaps you could cover that specifically.
Yeah.
Sudhir?
Yeah. So on the listed space, Shiv, the way we are not investors in the listed market as such. We don't kind of day in and day out. We don't look at the screen. In fact, we don't have a Bloomberg screen in our office. So we are more event investors. There has to be a primary investors always. We are not secondary investors. So to that extent, a company has to be raising capital and has to come to us to see if it makes sense. And there again, it is not just growth investment. If a company says that we want to do, there has to be something really significant, like a PVR doing an acquisition of a Cinemax and catapulting itself to a #1 position. There has to be some such events. And in that events, one is basically taking a view of whether that significant event acquisition stroke a significant management change is creating value. And those would be different from the conventional capital market driven valuation exercise that volatility. So to that extent, what we look at is we still apply the same private equity lens to looking at whatever we are looking on the listed market.
Quite right. But do you think that those kinds of opportunities are on the horizon, or they come up and it's very hard to model for those?
Yeah, so it keeps coming up, Shiv, whether it is a heated market. Obviously, when the market is high, they tend to reduce, but that doesn't take it away. You still have a company which is underperforming, and there is a management change that is happening, and the market has not discovered it yet. And you are now hearing the story of the new management and making that call whether you need to go into it. And your ability to do a lot of it is outside in diligence because you get the same amount of information from the listed company as the market, but you are still able to commission a lot more study and see what is the strength of that particular story and take that in. So our listed market investment would therefore be not the same beaten track of saying that buy something which is running up.
Right.
So for instance, Shiv, we did look at Max Life Insurance with Axis Bank solidifying that distribution partnership with an equity as well. Eventually, it did not fructify for other reasons of structuring and so on. Yeah.
Understood. And I think this question is also partly to us in the sense that do we see opportunities at attractive valuations in the listed space? And I think we do. This is if we buy the structural case for the India opportunity, and that's a very large opportunity. And once we start seeing things stabilize from the position that we are at, normalize, then depending on which sectors you're looking at, there could be extremely good opportunities for serious earnings growth, which means even at that valuation, many things could look interesting. So there are good businesses to be built and bought. I'll move on. There is a very interesting question on corporate strategy or business strategy here for Dream 11, which is how have they been able to hold back competition from other players who have mushroomed? Is there a learning we can all take away from this?
Yeah, so some businesses, do display the winner take all characteristic. So since Dream 11, see, I want to, state one thing which may not be so obvious to everybody. Dream 11 is a 12-year-old company. And from outside, it looks like a 2-year-old company. So whether in terms of technology that they have built, the data that they have collected, the consumer behavior that they have understood, And today, of course, they have 100 million registered users, and they are building it out to be an integrated sports engagement platform and not just a fantasy sport platform, to further connect the sports aficionados with themselves and understand their behavior and drive their behavior. Seems hard to replicate because it's a 12-year-old company which ramped up in the last 4 years. And for any other company, this is a bit like an exchange business, right? So when I have 100 million registered users, and let us say 20-25 million of them are paying users, I'm able to announce a 5 crore kitty and a 1 crore kitty, and even for a small league, of women's cricket, I'm able to put out a 50 lakh kitty and so on. That kind of product portfolio diversification for a new player, unless he burns his own money, will not be available. Then, because now we generate cash at the EBITDA level, and we are plowing back all of it to build the brand, uh, these monies are pretty serious amount of money. So today, if someone has to compete with Dream 11, at least $1 billion to $1.5 billion has to be put on the table, to build a serious competition, both arising from the lead you have in terms of the user base you have created and the cash flows that you are generating. So you go and block out media capacity, you're able to burn more money to keep the brand alive, you're able to announce more leagues, and you're able to build a more integrated platform. So that's how Harsh has gone about raising the bar of not allowing competition to be able to compete while there is nothing statutorily. Yeah.
And Renuka also, I think the way he thinks about the business is more sports entertainment. And therefore, the way he kind of advertises, for example, if you look at the Dream 11 advertisement, and today everyone is watching IPL and seeing the Dream 11 advertisements versus the advertisements that is being put out by competition. Competition will talk about, I play this because it allows me to earn money to fund my child's education. And it is seen as, and which is false inducements, right? Whereas what really it is just, it is not about competing with a star cricketer, or it is not about earning money to educate your child. It is entertainment at the end of the day. And when you think of it, it is a continuous process. You can build whatever moats that you have built, but even at each stage, you need to be positioning it right to take it to the next level. And I think the company's management has figured that right.
I think, Sudhir, I would argue that itself is a moat. If you're so focused on understanding what your customer is going to look at and what will appeal to them, in the example that you just take about the way they're positioning, not some abstract aspirational thing, but something quite specific, and that would appeal, that means they have a good finger on the pulse of the customer, right? And that if that understanding exists, it's a moat, can be a moat. I'll move on from this to back to the Fund 3 and a slightly larger question. We believe that private equity firms are sitting on $40 billion of dry powder in India, and that number is probably $1.5 trillion globally. So, so there are two questions here. Or before our questions, I'll make another principle here. We also talk about, when you're investing in a new fund, we talk about vintage, the years in which the investment is taking place, the deployment is taking place. And it's kind of thinking about market cycles, and then you hope that you get the right side of the cycle when those deployments are taking place. And with the pandemic, we thought that this might be a good vintage for Fund 3, a very good vintage. So, on the one hand, you've got this giant amount of cash flying around, right? And then you've had some stress here, but you're now going into deployment zone. So what is deal flow looking like for private equity in general, but Fund 3 in particular, in light of these things?
Yeah. So, I would say that just before COVID, we had intense flurry of minority opportunities. We were also very close to making commitments in a couple of companies, especially financial services companies. For them, capital is raw material. So they are always there in the market raising money. Then in the peak of COVID, of course, nobody was doing anything on their cap table unless there were serious pressures of secondary, kind of exit. Currently, what we are saying, Shiv, is large companies and large scale divestment. So, for instance, this is known again publicly. So, Piramal Glass, right? This is a company which is a very good company, very well built out, excellent management, great market positioning, all of that. But the owner of Piramal Glass would like to exit this business and redeploy that capital in other chosen lines of businesses. So we do see very, very large transactions. All of us read about this JB Chemicals being acquired by KKR. These are 3,000 crore plus checks. So these are big strategic decisions in companies which are not affected by COVID, where people are liquidating it for redeployment of those capital. I see far fewer transactions of a routine minority investment like an N-Cube or an Natco or any of those deals. They are much fewer at this point of time, maybe because these companies need little more time to consolidate post-COVID and then come into the market to raise some equity. But we do see a lot of corporate restructuring transactions where I'm spinning out certain businesses which can do better or have highly differentiated valuations compared to my core business, for which I'm looking for partnerships with private equity. We are also seeing a lot of control transactions, including in the insurance space. There are stress promoters who are exiting, highly profitable, good franchise businesses. So I would say that currently the market has much more larger deals of stronger franchises who are doing either strategic shifts in their ownership or completely exiting them for restructuring their own personal balance sheet.
So I guess the question on many people's minds is that you had the first close of the fund late last year. Of course, then we had the pandemic, so you're now thinking of making the first deployment in the next couple of months, as it happens from the last communication. By the way, congratulations on those closes. Also, we've got the ADB and CPPIB and other marquee investors coming in, alongside many of our esteemed clients. But the question is, so something is imminent, then from amongst these, can we expect a transaction to take place and a deployment to take place in the next 2-3 months as planned?
Right. So let me address it, and Sudhir can, add to it. So we had almost signed up with 2 companies just before COVID, and we were in one of them waiting RBI approval because it was a change of control. And it was a company which operated under RBI license. And in another company, we were just waiting to close the documents. But because of COVID, both in financial services, we said we need to take a pause and we just can't go on the basis of past diligence and past assumptions, because COVID was fundamentally changing the future outlook of these companies. And we decided to be cautious, and we kind of stayed away from those transactions. After that, we came very, very close to investing in White Hat Junior. The promoter, Karan Bajaj, was very clear that if I go the private equity route, then I will definitely take only multiples in my cap table. But I'm seriously evaluating a strategic, and he decided to sell himself out to Byju's. So we did, end up not doing a few transactions which were like a cup and lip. There was another pharmaceutical company which is privately owned. We were looking at a private equity investor divesting and the company itself raising some more money for some corporate restructuring of their international business. We spent a lot of time, almost got to a binding term sheet situation, and the company said that we are going to put off this entire fundraise until we have complete clarity on our international business restructuring. So our business is very tough in terms of how many stars have to come together for a deal to happen. On top of it, unfortunately, with passage of time, we have become wise. So we are not able to kid ourselves and commit capital to opportunities where if we were less experienced, probably we would have got more excited. So our lens have become tighter. On the public market side, as Sudhir said, we want to only do event-based. We don't want to do organic. equity raise, because again, we have been badly beaten up. In an organic equity raise, the issuer times himself very well, and we are not able to time ourselves. So we have kind of restricted our public investing strategy, and therefore we have to wait for the right deal. But there are many deals that our teams are very, very actively working on. We have a stellar team which is so experienced, and we have used all our years of experience to be translated into very good tools and frameworks, so that we don't leave our success to chance. Success is scientific. We choose our investments very scientifically, but we manage our investments very skillfully. And we take a lot of pride in saying that Multiples is a shop that combines the art and this science of investing in an inimitable manner. So we'll have to wait for the right deals. For sure, we will put out your money around the right opportunities. And what I want to say about this vintage is that we will fly towards stronger companies. We are happy to settle for a few percentage points lower returns, but we will not chase companies which could run the risk of not finding the next round of capital, or does not have the highest class of management or the ability to hire the best of management, and so on. So we would shoot out for a net return in the hands of the investors on a compounded basis anywhere from 20 to 22%. We are not going to promise a 35%. But in the portfolio, we would have a few digital opportunities which could give a 30 to 40% return, and a few others which may give very safe net 18% return, and in a combined way deliver a 20 to 22% return, is what I would like to say. Sudhi, you can contradict me also, and you will prevail.
We can say 40% and we'll split the difference and just say 30.
Yeah.
No, more than the returns, I just wanted to say that the pace of our investment, for example, in our Fund 1 and Fund 2, we have together put out 22 investments in 9 years. So we do about 2.5 investments a year on an average. And there are years where we have done 3 to 4. There are years where we have done 1 or 2 investments, and so on. Our investment period for this fund started in January 1st. We did our last investment out of our Fund 2 in December, which was Quantify. So it's basically a barren period of 9 months, which is not alarming, which is not, ideally we would have liked to do an investment or so, but it's not alarming either. These are phases that happen in our business, and particularly in a scenario like COVID, where we deliberately said that let us be a lot more careful about looking at it. It was only to be anticipated. But that said, we do believe that, and I mentioned this earlier as well, we do believe that today there is it's a bipolar industry in private equity. There are some very large deals happening, like Piramal Glass that Renuka spoke about, and there are tech deals happening. The middle is really missing, because for a fairly long time, India Inc. has not been investing. And my sense is that will come back over the next 2 to 3 years. And therefore, when you start investing in, say, 21, etc., you will find the space. I expect the pace will be more interesting.
Okay, I think that does illuminate the question quite a lot. And it's always possible that you find 2 or 3.
Shiv,
Sorry,
also,
go ahead.
Simultaneously, our team, we have 2 very strong financial services deals that we are working on. There are 2 pharma sector deals that we are working on. There are a couple of consumer tech sector that we are working on. So they can all come together. It is like so many.
It can all happen at the same time. So nothing happens for a long time, and then everything happens. Yeah.
Which is at play at this point of time. Yeah.
Quite. I think that covers it. So, just speaking from the point of view of some of our investors who are relatively new, those that are relatively new talk about the tenor of the investment. The life of the fund is 10+2. And of course, when we talk to our clients, we are fiduciaries like your fiduciaries. we talk about the context of being in the fund, or from the point of view of asset allocation in the first place, where alternatives have a role to play, the excess return that you can earn. But then we also have to answer this question. Now, in reality, the cash flow profile of an investor in a private equity fund doesn't look like they're holding it on for 10 years, right? You deploy and then you start getting it back. So can you just talk about that a little bit to give some of our investors who have this question about the life and tenor, a sense of what is really the true size of when is your capital going, when is it coming? Could you just comment on that a little bit?
Yeah. So, very, very technically speaking, this is a very long-term product. We cannot precisely tell our investors when we will draw the money for deployment and when we will return, because the only return is when you sell the asset. Right? There is no periodic cash flows like a interest or coupon in our structures. Having said this, in multiples, we have a deep desire to run our funds to a rhythm because we just feel that having that rhythm and that discipline is just good for our business, and we can scale well that way. So the rhythm that we have tried to run multiples so far, which is something we want to pursue, is the drawdown happens over 4 years. Roughly in the first year, the drawdown is low because you're also building the pipeline and the momentum for the deployment. So first year is 10 to 15%, and thereafter the subsequent 3 years, it is almost in equal percentage. And then when we come to the 5th year, we are already, some of the early assets are ready and ripe for divestment. And if you sell a quarter or 1/3 of your portfolio at 3x your entry valuations, after 3 to 4 years, you are returning the entire money. So so by the 5th or the 6th year, from a year to date kind of standpoint, you have returned the money. But if you look at the duration, it would be 4 years because you're also drawing down the money over a period of time. So if someone has committed 50 crores, let's say in the first year, we may draw down 5 to 7 crores, the balance equally in the subsequent 3 years. And when you come to year 4, you are already looking at receiving somewhere between year 4 and year 5, your entire 50 crores back. So, and the duration of this whole process would be about 4 years, is the rhythm that we are looking to run. So, and again, I'm trying to make it as programmatic as possible, although this is not a business that's amenable to those kind of program. But when I say programmatic, I've just raised the consciousness of my team by putting these matrices, measuring them, talking about them, and making people accountable to these, matrices in terms of. So for our fund 2, we have come up with a number that we have to exit in the next 12 to 18 months, which are the assets where we could exit. And so that we continue with the fund 1 rhythm with a duration of 4 years, you have returned the principal. And then the next immediate target is to return the preferred return of 10% within 5 years. So, and then we also want to come back into the market every 3 years to raise money. So the rhythm that I have set in multiples is be in the market every 3 years to raise money, return the money that you have taken, the principal, within 4 years, principal plus preferred return in the 5 years. So once an investor does 2 cycles with us, so if someone started with 10 crores in the first fund, and let's say 20 crores in the second fund, in the third fund, this investor could commit to a 40 crores or a 50 crores without having to put out 1 extra rupee from his pocket, because the returns from the previous funds will just take care of this rotational money. And that is the multiplier effect that we are looking to play. There could be short timing mismatches, but one can easily arrange an overdraft with a bank or somebody to take care of these timing mismatches secured against other assets that the investor would have. And that's really the fun part of this business, as to how do you multiply your exposure without having to put out an extra rupee of cash from your pocket. So that's what we are trying to achieve in multiples.
Okay, thank you, Renuka. I think your experience in Fund 1 and 2, of course, bears out much of what you're saying as well. So that's good news.
So
You know, we're all.
If I look at Dream 11, we have taken out, we've already taken out $91 million and distributed to our investors. But there are many investors along with me in Dream 11 who have not taken out a fraction of the money we have taken. That doesn't make us any less bullish about the future. But it is just that this is our job. Our job is to return the money, so don't get the greed, get the better of you. And the good thing is that in our portfolio, almost all assets make money. Of course, as I speak in Fund 2, I expect 2 assets not to return my capital. In Fund 1, 1 asset did not, 2 assets again, but one of them was trivial, did not return capital. But we don't have to maximize out of only 1 asset out of 11 companies. 8 to 9 of them will make a lot of money. Some of them will make hell of a lot of money. So we are able to put it in this program because of our chosen strategy as well.
Right. So, we're coming right to the end of this session.
And also we have done the public market equivalent for both our funds. As we speak, we are a comfortable 5 to 6% higher than the public market equivalent, right, Sudeep? Mute.
That's right.
Yeah. That's after accounting for the circumstances that we're in, I guess. So that's good news.
Yeah.
Okay. As I was saying, I think we're almost at the end of this. I have something on a light-hearted note from someone here. Sudhir, you mentioned Joker in the pack earlier, and I'm going to suggest it's also the elephant in the room, maybe not the room, but in our mind space. But the US election took place last night. Elephant, as it happens, is the Republican election symbol. Right? Now, would either of you care to venture what happens next?
Not me.
Shiv, as somehow I am somehow a couple of questions have reminded me of these WhatsApp memes that are happening. It said that you may fret and fume, but tomorrow your president is still going to be Ramnath Kovind.
Right.
So yeah, but yeah, it seems too close, right? It kind of at one point it looked like the Biden's lead, at least a month back, it looked like the lead is so significant, but it seems to have narrowed down, and now it seems to be.
To that extent, it seems a repeat of what happened in 2. To that extent, it seems a repeat. There are some differences, of course. And we'll need to see now what happens with the ballots that are to be mailed in. But if it starts delaying things, then there could be some interim volatility.
I'm not worried about the delay as much as what people are predicting, a long-drawn legal battle and so on. And if it doesn't cede power, I guess if Trump wins, at least there is no transitionary issues. But if there is a transition issue otherwise, then it will look very clumsy for not the biggest democracy, but at least the
richest democracy, oldest, richest. Yes, I suppose. I think, look, there could be some volatility in the meanwhile, depending on how this gets resolved. But at the end of the day, we're going to be in a high stimulus environment for a while to come, whoever there is. And so from an economy point of view and its effect on India, I think there are longer term, larger forces at play in either scenario that really should keep us on a particular path, perhaps. Okay. Renuka, we were talking about your portfolio companies, and some of our colleagues wanted to take this opportunity to talk about Sanctum, your portfolio company as well. Yeah. How are you seeing the progress of Sanctum? There are challenges, of course, which we've talked about from a regulatory point of view, but opportunities as well, which are structural in nature, and we've been working to execute against those. So perhaps a closing comment might be helpful.
Yeah, definitely, I will say, but Sudhir must say. So one, again, I talked about the agility of our management and how quickly they recalibrated their plan. Sanctum definitely scores a very high rank in the display of the same agility, Shiv. I mean, right from infrastructure re-engineering to reduce cost, to some of the strategic rethinking that you did, and the cost-cutting measures in a services business where human capital is the only thing that you have put to play, is a remarkable one. So, you and your team are amongst the entrepreneurs we salute. And secondly, the volatility, the customer questions that you have to answer, the volatility in the assets under management, inability to launch new products. So the challenges have been multifold to you and your team, but I think all of you held up so stoically, thinking very logically about what will get you to survive in such a challenging time. So I would say that our confidence about Sanctum has dramatically improved, in this period, and we so dearly want you to succeed for all of this hard work, and we will definitely stand behind you to make you all very, very clear winners. You may have preferred to be a very prolific platform with multiple products and all of that, but unfortunately the market conditions are dictating otherwise, and somewhere we have to surrender to the laws of the universe and can't swim against current and hope to be successful. So I'm sure all of us will be humble enough to listen to the market and do something that's appropriate and in line with what the market dictates and what your customers want, rather than just operate from our aspiration. So step by step, put your bricks and you will build an incredibly powerful platform. Your chosen strategy of not being a manufacturing company, but a pure advisor, is also something that I'd like to mention as something that stands apart, which says that I'm not an opportunistic player. I think about my customers and I don't want to confuse them, or I don't want to be conflicting with my manufacturers. Again, these speak to the values that will hold Sanctum in very good stead for several decades. So, all in all, I think you have built an incredibly professional shop, which got immensely tested in this COVID period, and all of you have come out winners through your personal sacrifices and very, very serious strategic calls that you have taken. And we really commend what you have done, and we want to see you even much more successful than where you are today. Yeah.
Thank you, Renuka. That's
and Shiv, I of course have closely watched with a lot of pride and with a lot of admiration, the amount of product diversity that you have built in, the way the research, the fact that some of your PMS portfolios, the way it has performed. I guess huge respect for the various teams that have done all of these incredible work. I think for me, kind of looking at companies evolve, I think a lot of what makes companies successful, and particularly in financial services, is the culture that you put, the foundation that you built in the first 3-4 years. Because once that is set and once the foundation is set, then it kind of builds on top of that. And I would kind of take some examples. For example, in the first 5-7 years of HDFC Bank, probably they were not the stars, right? You would have thought that some other banks are winning the race, far more aggressive, far more implementing technology. But once that foundation gets built and your culture gets set, then you can kind of repeat it a lot more. And I think that is where Sanctum has done very well, as Renuka mentioned, to create that culture and and the people platform that you have built.
okay. Thank you, Renuka and Sudhir. I guess we were just to note to our clients, this was not a planted sort of ending to the whole conversation. We appreciate the support from our investors, stakeholders, and we appreciate what the team has done during this time. And I think this might sound self-serving, but Centerpiece is looking out for client interests and building strong foundations. That's how we think about it. And we're very pleased with the progress ourselves. So I'm afraid we're at the end of our time. So thank you again to all of our attendees for taking the time out at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. That makes an extra special note of appreciation for the timing alone. And Renuka, Sudhir, thank you for the very candid, very personal, look at all of the subjects that we were looking at, where we are from an economy point of view, businesses, where the opportunities might lie, and also specific to the Fund 3, where we might be at this point in time. I'm hopeful that our clients and attendees also benefited from it. If any of our attendees wish to discuss more specific matters on a more bilateral basis with either our team or multiple team, we would request you to reach out to your relationship managers, and we'll organize for that to happen. And in course of time, we'll have more some such sessions, and we hope that you will join us as well.